The day my husband left me for his assistant was the same day I drove away in his favorite car, the one he always said we'd buy together. 4 years, I had sacrificed my own dreams for his, supporting him through every decision while silently watching my own life slip away. But when he walked out, something inside me snapped. I'd already bought the car he wanted, and in that moment, I realized that I had spent far too long living for someone else. As I gripped the wheel, tears stinging my eyes, I didn't just leave him behind, I was leaving the version of myself who had settled. Now, it was time to reclaim my life, my happiness, and my future. Before we dive back in, let us know where you're tuning in from. If this story resonates with you, don't forget to hit that subscribe button because tomorrow, I've got something even more special lined up just for you. It was the sound of the door slamming shut that tore through the quiet of my home, an almost physical punch to my chest. My heart hammered in my throat as I stood frozen, staring at the empty space where my husband had just been. The shock was overwhelming, paralyzing, like a distant echo that had no place in my reality. He was gone. And the cruelest part, he wasn't coming back. I hadn't heard him leave. It was as if he'd made up his mind and executed his decision so swiftly, so coldly, that I was left grasping for the pieces. The silence that followed was deafening. The weight of his absence settled over me, sinking deeper with every breath I took. There were no last words, no explanation, no pleas for reconciliation. Just an empty house. An empty future. I stumbled into the living room, my mind racing to catch up with what had just unfolded. I had always believed that marriage was something sacred, something worth fighting for, no matter how many storms you weathered. We had weathered our share, too. But what I hadn't seen coming, what I couldn't have predicted, was the sudden, unthinkable betrayal that had shattered everything we built together. The memory of his last words echoed in my mind. "I'm in love with someone else. It's over." Those words felt like they were carved into the very air, thick with finality. The sting of his confession hit me harder than anything I'd ever felt before. But what I hadn't anticipated was the devastation that came with it. This wasn't just a sudden decision made on a whim. He had been planning it. I could feel it in my bones. This wasn't a moment of impulse, but a culmination of thoughts and actions that had been brewing beneath the surface for months, maybe longer. My stomach twisted, and a wave of nausea washed over me. But it wasn't just the shock of his departure. It was the betrayal that cut the deepest. He hadn't even had the decency to talk to me about it before making his choice. I had been married to this man for over 15 years, and yet, I had been blindsided. And to make matters worse, the person he had left me for, the one who had so casually taken my place in his life, was his assistant. A woman half my age, someone I had trusted, someone who I had once thought of as a colleague. I tried to steady myself, but the dizziness was overwhelming. My thoughts scrambled in every direction, trying to piece together the signs I had missed. There had to have been something I didn't see. Something I had failed to notice while my world was consumed with the needs of our home, our children, and his career. But now, in the wake of this revelation, there was no going back. I stood in the middle of our living room, surrounded by the remnants of a life I had carefully built. I couldn't even begin to fathom the depth of the wound I was feeling, but one thing was painfully clear. I was no longer the woman who would simply accept this. I was no longer the wife who would put her own needs last. Something had shifted inside me, and I had no idea where it would lead, but I knew I couldn't keep living this lie. As I stood there, my phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a message from my best friend, Laura, probably checking in, knowing something was wrong. She'd always been there for me, always supportive, but for some reason, I couldn't bring myself to talk to her. I couldn't find the words. Not yet. But then, a sudden thought cut through the fog of my emotions. There was one thing I had done for myself in all these years. One decision I had made quietly, without consulting anyone. It wasn't a big thing in the grand scheme of things, but it was mine. It was a symbol of something I had done for me, for the woman I used to be before I became a wife, before I became a mother. I had bought the car. His car. The one he had always dreamed of owning but had never made the time to actually buy for himself. The one he had always hinted at, saying we'd buy it together. A luxury car, sleek and expensive, something far beyond our usual budget. But when I made that decision a few months ago, I didn't do it for him. I did it for me. I had never told him. I had kept it a secret, waiting for the right moment. It was my own little indulgence, a piece of my past self that had been buried beneath years of family obligations. Now, it felt like a cruel joke. Here I was, standing in the wreckage of my marriage, and I was about to get in the car that symbolized my desire to reclaim something for myself. Something that would remind me of who I used to be before I lost myself in him. I grabbed my coat, trying to steady my shaking hands. My heart ached, but there was a strange sense of empowerment creeping in as well. Maybe this betrayal, this loss, was the push I needed to finally start living for myself. The life I had set aside for years. It was time to get behind the wheel of that car, to take the first step into an uncertain future. It wasn't the future I had imagined when I said my vows, but it was mine. And maybe that was enough. The car sat in the driveway, gleaming in the late afternoon sunlight. I hadn't even touched it yet, hadn't so much as sat in the driver's seat. Every time I looked at it, it felt like a reminder of a life I had almost forgotten, one I had put on hold for the sake of my marriage, my family, and his career. Now, as I stood there staring at it, it felt like the only thing that had ever truly been mine. And it terrified me. But I needed to drive it. I needed to feel something that was mine, even if it was only a material possession. So, I slid into the plush leather seats, gripping the steering wheel with a mix of excitement and dread. It felt like the car was welcoming me, as if it knew the woman who was finally starting to emerge, the woman who had been buried under the weight of responsibility, self-sacrifice, and love for far too long. I thought about the life I had spent with him, the man I had built everything with, the one I had dedicated my entire being to. We had met in college, bright-eyed and full of ambition, and from the very start, I had put everything into our relationship. My dreams had been simple. I wanted a family, a home, and a partnership that would endure. But somewhere along the way, my dreams had become his dreams, and mine had slipped through the cracks. I had put my career on hold, convinced that supporting his dreams would fulfill me. I had sacrificed holidays, birthdays, and milestones because I was a mother, a wife, and a nurse. Always giving, always caring, always there for everyone else, but never for myself. When we got married, I didn't expect the world. I didn't expect romance or grand gestures, but I did expect loyalty. I expected partnership. But as time went on, I watched him slowly drift away. His career took precedence over everything. He worked long hours, left on business trips, came home exhausted, and yet he was always the priority. I became the woman who cooked dinners alone, attended parent-teacher conferences by herself, and spent endless nights waiting for him to come home, wondering if he even remembered I existed beyond being his wife. I had tried to tell myself it was all worth it. That if I just kept supporting him, things would get better. That one day, he'd recognize all the sacrifices I made for the family. But that day never came. He got promoted, and then he got distracted. First, it was the late meetings, then the extra trips. And then, there was her. Her name was Sarah. She had started as his assistant a few years ago, and I'd noticed the change in his behavior almost immediately. He became more distracted, more irritable when he came home, often mentioning her in passing. But it wasn't just that. There was something in the way he spoke about her, the way his eyes lingered a moment longer when he talked about her work or how efficient she was. At first, I thought I was imagining things, but the small things began to add up. I noticed the late-night texts on his phone, the private meetings, the odd silence when he was talking to her in front of me, like a guarded, secret part of his life that I was no longer a part of. I wanted to confront him about it, but the fear of losing everything kept me quiet. I wasn't naive. I knew what was happening, but I didn't want to face the truth. I told myself it was just a phase, that the excitement of a new work relationship would wear off. I convinced myself that he loved me and that eventually, things would return to normal. But then, the betrayal hit hard. He came home that evening, looking unusually disheveled, and barely acknowledged me as he passed through the front door. I had dinner waiting, but he didn't even glance at it. He sat down on the couch and looked at me with a strange expression, something between guilt and resolve. That's when he told me about Sarah. That's when he told me he was in love with her, that he was leaving. I felt like the floor had been ripped out from under me. Every doubt, every insecurity I had pushed away for years, suddenly rushed in, drowning me. He had already made up his mind. He had already planned his life with her. And I was just a bystander in my own marriage. The betrayal felt like a brutal punch to the gut, but it wasn't just the affair that hurt. It was the fact that I had been blind to it for so long. How had I been so caught up in his needs that I failed to see my own life slipping away? How had I let him strip away my identity, my sense of self? The more I thought about it, the angrier I became. Anger at him, at myself, at the years I had wasted believing that if I just kept giving, everything would work out. But it hadn't. And now, here I was, standing at the precipice of a life I didn't recognize. As I drove the car for the first time, my emotions were a whirlwind. I didn't know where I was going, but it didn't matter. I needed to be somewhere, anywhere, other than the place I had spent so many years of my life. The car roared to life as I pressed the accelerator, and for the first time in a long while, I felt a flicker of freedom. It was small, almost imperceptible, but it was there. The road stretched out before me, endless and open. I couldn't help but wonder what would happen if I stopped looking back at the life I had left behind. If I stopped caring about what he thought, about what everyone thought. Maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something new. The weeks that followed his departure were a suffocating blur, a constant storm of emotion that seemed impossible to navigate. At first, I was too stunned to feel anything. The pain was so sharp and sudden that it numbed me, leaving me hollow. I spent my days in a fog, dragging myself from one moment to the next, going through the motions like an actor playing a role in a life that no longer felt real. It was as if I had suddenly become a spectator in my own life, watching it all crumble in front of me but too paralyzed to stop it. The kids were confused. I could see it in their eyes as they looked at me, waiting for some kind of explanation that I couldn't give. How could I explain to them that their father, the man who had promised us forever, had chosen to walk away? How could I make them understand that the life we once shared was gone, shattered by the presence of another woman? They didn't deserve this. They deserved more than I could give them right now. But I did my best to keep it together for them. I got up each morning, made breakfast, took them to school, and tried to smile through the tears. I even pretended to be okay when I spoke to friends or family, hiding the brokenness beneath a mask of normalcy. But inside, I was unraveling. The phone calls from his lawyer started soon after. The divorce papers. The legal separation. It felt like being kicked while I was already down. I wasn't ready to sign anything. I wasn't ready to let go, to admit that the man I had loved for so many years had truly chosen someone else. But it wasn't just the legalities that were crushing me. It was the emotional toll. I could still see his face, hear his voice, feel his presence in every corner of this house. I kept expecting him to walk through the door, to apologize, to say this was all some terrible mistake. But he didn't. And with each passing day, the weight of the truth settled deeper in my chest. I had been replaced. He had moved on, and there was no room for me in his new life. I didn't want to acknowledge it, but I had to. There was no avoiding the reality. He had left me for her. For Sarah. The woman who had been his assistant. The woman who had gradually wormed her way into every part of his life until there was no space left for me. The woman who, up until this moment, I had trusted. I had welcomed her into our home, our lives, never once thinking she would be the one to tear everything apart. I thought back to the times I had felt the smallest pangs of doubt. The late nights he stayed at work, the quiet phone calls that never seemed to be meant for me, the moments when I would find his gaze lingering a little too long on Sarah. But I dismissed those thoughts. I convinced myself I was overreacting, that everything was fine, that I was just being paranoid. Now, I realized how foolish I had been. I could almost hear his voice in my head, justifying his actions, telling me he was happy with her, that he had fallen in love with her. I had once believed in love's ability to endure anything. Hardships, sacrifices, time, but now I felt like I was drowning in a sea of betrayal. He had made his choice, and there was nothing left for me to do but accept it. But then came the anger. It wasn't the fiery rage I had expected, but something quieter, more devastating. It was the anger of feeling invisible, of realizing that all those years of putting him first had meant nothing. He hadn't appreciated any of it. None of the late nights I spent waiting for him, none of the holidays I missed, none of the dreams I buried for the sake of our family. He had thrown it all away in an instant, like it was nothing. Like I was nothing. For weeks, I let this anger simmer beneath the surface, twisting inside me until I was sure I couldn't take it anymore. It was a constant ache, gnawing at my soul, but I couldn't show it. I couldn't break down in front of the kids. I couldn't let anyone see how much it hurt. But there were moments, late at night, when the house was silent and the world outside seemed to disappear, when I would break. I would lie in bed, crying quietly so I wouldn't wake them, my heart heavy with the weight of it all. But then, something shifted. The anger, the sadness, the heartbreak, they all started to feel like something else. They started to feel like fuel. For the first time, I felt a flicker of something other than pain. It was small at first, like the smallest spark in the dark, but it was there. Something inside me was awakening. Something that had been buried under years of sacrifice and self-doubt. I wasn't just going to be the victim of this betrayal. I wasn't going to let him take everything from me. I had given up so much of myself for him, for our family, that I had forgotten who I was. But that was going to change. The moment he had walked out, he had taken more than just my husband. He had taken a part of me that I had forgotten was mine. But I was ready to take it back. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. I had been living for him for so long, living for everyone except myself. But this was my life, and I was no longer going to let anyone else control it. The car. The damn car. The thing that had always been his dream, the thing I had kept secret, was no longer just an object. It was mine. It was my rebellion, my first step toward reclaiming what was mine. My freedom, my independence, my future. I had hidden that car from him for months, bought it in secret because I knew that it was something I needed for me. It wasn't about impressing him. It wasn't about making him see how much I could give. It was about taking something for myself. Something that was purely mine. And now, it felt like the perfect metaphor for everything I was about to do. I hadn't just bought a car. I had bought myself the freedom to start over. But there was still one more thing I had to do. I had to stop pretending. I had to stop being the woman who waited around for someone else to decide her worth. I had to stop pretending that I didn't deserve more than what he had given me. That night, as I sat in the car, the weight of the situation finally hit me. This was the turning point. I was done being the woman who had sacrificed everything for someone who couldn't even appreciate it. It was time to take control. It was time to reclaim my life. And the first step was simple. I picked up my phone. I dialed a number I had avoided for weeks. The lawyer. I wasn't going to let him walk away with everything. I wasn't going to let him get away with this. Not anymore. The day I called my lawyer felt like a line in the sand, a threshold I knew I could never cross back over. For weeks, I had allowed myself to stay in a haze, not ready to face what I had to do. But that afternoon, as I sat in my living room, staring at the empty space where my husband's things used to be, something inside me clicked. I was no longer that woman, the one who waited patiently for things to change. The one who swallowed her pain and put her head down, thinking it would all work out in the end. I wasn't waiting for anyone anymore. I wasn't waiting for him to come to his senses, for some grand apology or for things to go back to how they used to be. I had spent so many years giving myself up for him, sacrificing my own dreams, my own desires, my very identity, while he had simply moved on. He had made his choice. Now, it was time for me to make mine. When my lawyer picked up, I told her I was ready to start the process. The words felt strange on my tongue, like they belonged to someone else, but at the same time, they felt freeing. The very act of taking that step, of ending this chapter, was an admission to myself that I was no longer the person who had been dependent on someone else's approval. I was doing this for me. For my own peace. For the life I had neglected for too long. It wasn't just about divorce. It wasn't just about the end of my marriage. It was about taking back control of the life I had given up. I needed to prove to myself that I could rise from this, stronger, wiser, and more independent than I had ever been before. And then came the twist, the thing I hadn't seen coming. The very same evening I signed the preliminary divorce papers, my lawyer called me back with some unexpected news. Apparently, while my husband had been busy with Sarah, he had been running some things under the radar. It wasn't uncommon for someone in his position to have a few assets tucked away, but what she uncovered was far more than I had anticipated. The life insurance policy, the offshore account, the investments, all things he had kept hidden from me. They were substantial. Substantial enough to change everything. At first, I didn't understand. How had he gotten away with this? How had he concealed so much? But then, I remembered the moments. The strange meetings, the late nights, the money he had seemed to always have when it was time for a new investment. He had always been careful, always secretive when it came to the finances, even though I had managed our household budget for years. It wasn't unusual for him to want privacy in that area, but now I knew the truth. He had been hiding far more than just a second relationship. My lawyer was as stunned as I was. She explained that I had a legitimate claim to everything that had been hidden, including the large sum in his offshore account. It was a vast fortune, one that I had no idea existed, and it was mine by right. He had been so focused on getting away with his affair, so consumed by his new life, that he had never thought to cover his tracks completely. He had made a mistake. It was surreal. For a moment, I sat there in silence, processing what I had just learned. All this time, I had believed I had nothing. I had believed that my life was over, that I was being cast aside, forgotten. And yet here I was, holding the key to a future I had never even dreamed of. I had been drowning in the loss of my marriage, too focused on the emotional scars, to see the hidden treasure that had always been within my grasp. My anger, my pain, they had clouded my vision, kept me from seeing the power I held in my hands. I wasn't just walking away from him. I was walking into a new life, one where I was in control of my own destiny. I didn't need his approval, his validation, or his support. I had enough of my own now to stand on my own 2 feet. It felt like the universe had conspired to give me a gift in the form of this hidden wealth, this security I had never known. It wasn't just about the money. It was about the freedom it represented, the freedom to choose my own path, to leave behind the bitterness and betrayal and build something new for myself. I wasn't just going to survive this. I was going to thrive. I thought back to the car. The one he had always dreamed of owning, the one I had secretly purchased months before. It had seemed like such a small, almost indulgent purchase at the time. A way for me to assert my own desires, to treat myself for once. But now, it felt like the beginning of a larger transformation. The car wasn't just a luxury, it was a declaration. It was a reminder that I had the power to make choices for myself, that I could take control of my future without asking for permission. It was a symbol of my independence, of my refusal to be defined by his actions anymore. That night, I drove the car again. This time, I didn't just drive for the sake of driving. I drove with intention. I drove toward my future, toward my freedom. The road ahead was unknown, but for the first time in a long time, I wasn't afraid. I felt a sense of clarity that had eluded me for years. I wasn't the woman who would sit back and wait for things to happen. I wasn't the woman who would settle for a life that wasn't mine. I was the woman who would make her own way, who would create a future for herself, one where she would no longer be defined by the choices of others. I had been through the worst, and now, it was my turn to rise. And as I drove into the night, I knew this was just the beginning. The days that followed felt like a shift in the very fabric of my reality. The revelation about the hidden wealth, the secret accounts, the life insurance policy, everything I thought I had lost suddenly became a doorway to something far greater. The man who had betrayed me, the man who had been my partner for over a decade, had unwittingly handed me the keys to my own salvation. And I wasn't going to waste it. It wasn't just the money. It was the freedom it represented. It was the validation that I wasn't powerless in this situation. For so long, I had felt like I was at the mercy of his decisions, of his whims. But now, the tables had turned. The power that I had unknowingly been holding in my hands was now mine to wield. The financial security I had been too dependent on him for was now my own. I could do whatever I wanted with it. And I was going to. I spent the next few weeks taking stock of my life. I met with my lawyer, not just to finalize the divorce but to ensure that I could protect myself and my children. We talked about investments, about ensuring that the money was not only secured for the future but also used to give me a life I had long dreamed of, a life I had neglected for far too long. My children would have everything they needed, and I would have the resources to rebuild. It was a fresh start, a new beginning that I could shape entirely on my terms. I also started to put plans into action for my own life. I began looking into career opportunities, things that I had put on the back burner for years. I was a nurse, yes, but there were other things I had always been passionate about. I had been so focused on being the perfect wife, the perfect mother, that I had forgotten to focus on myself. But now I was determined to live fully, to take the steps I had always dreamed of taking. I remembered the trips we had always talked about taking together, vacations that had never happened, promises made but never kept. I knew now that I wasn't going to wait for anyone to give me permission to live. I booked a solo trip to Europe, a luxury vacation that I had always dreamed of. I wasn't doing this to get back at him, but rather to prove to myself that I didn't need anyone else to experience the world. This was for me. This was the life I deserved. The trip was just the beginning. As I explored the world, I realized something profound. I had been living for so long in the shadow of his choices, letting him define who I was. Now, I was creating a life where I was the one in control. The car, the money, the vacation, these weren't just symbols of material wealth. They were declarations of independence, of freedom, of reclaiming everything that had once been mine. There were moments of doubt, of course. The weight of the betrayal still lingered, creeping into my thoughts at unexpected times. There were moments when I felt small, when I wondered if I was doing the right thing. But every time that doubt crept in, I reminded myself that I was moving forward. I was growing. I was learning to live for myself, to stand on my own 2 feet, to build a future that I could call my own. I also made sure to focus on my children. They needed stability, and I was committed to providing that for them. The transition wasn't easy, but we made it work. The house became a place of healing, a place where we could grow and find peace. I worked hard to make sure they knew they were loved, that the betrayal wasn't their fault. Together, we would move forward, and together, we would thrive. And then, there was him. I hadn't heard from him much since the divorce papers were signed. At first, I felt anger when I thought about him. The man who had once been my everything, the man who had promised to love me forever, only to throw it all away. I wanted him to feel the hurt, to understand the damage he had caused. But as the weeks passed, the anger faded, replaced by a more profound sense of detachment. He was no longer the center of my world, no longer the man I had built my life around. He had his new life with Sarah, and I had my own now. His choices didn't define me anymore. His betrayal didn't define me anymore. One day, out of nowhere, I received a message from him. It was short, almost casual, and it made my blood boil. He asked if I was okay, if the kids were adjusting well. And then, as if nothing had happened, he signed off with an "I miss you." The nerve. The audacity. I stared at the message for a long time. The old me, the one who had been so eager to please, to make everything okay, might have responded, might have tried to salvage some semblance of connection. But not me now. Not this version of me. This version of me had learned to let go of the past and embrace the future. This version of me was no longer interested in chasing someone who had so easily walked away. I deleted the message without a second thought. I realized in that moment that I had already let go. I wasn't just healing. I was thriving. I had taken my pain, my heartbreak, and turned it into strength. I had taken back control of my life, and in doing so, I had found the person I was always meant to be. As I drove my car, my symbol of independence, through the open road, I realized something. I wasn't running away from my past. I was driving toward my future. A future where I was in control. A future where I would no longer allow anyone else to define my worth. I was free. And that was all that mattered.